Hey there, welcome to the Pelvis Project podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Roxy. We're two pelvic health experts brought together by passion for our careers, entrepreneurship, motherhood, and the desire for intentional relationships.
Join us in our mission to spread pelvic floor awareness and start conversations surrounding the truth behind genuine health, imperfect wellness, and joyfully navigating life. We are so glad you are here with us.
Let's start the conversation. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning.
It's a wonderful Wednesday.
Oh, it's always a fun Wednesday when we do our podcast recording. How is it where you're at? Is it rainy?
It is
And kind of
foggy, and
yes,
it's foggy, and it's slushy. All that snow we got dumped on is melting, and it's a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's been a little slick in the mornings here too. And I've got a sick kiddo home with me today. So I gave him directions of, it's like I need, I know you guys cannot see us. And I get asked often, like, where do you record the podcast? I'm like, oh, just in my office around my junk. And it's like, I need the light on the outside where I can flip it up to be like, don't walk in the room because I'm recording. But I told him, I said, Mama's going to be recording the podcast. So he knows if he comes in the room to be very quiet. So if this podcast has any interruptions of a child, that's my little guy.
Little Owen. Oh. Well, let's introduce our guest today. We have another guest that we're so excited about.
Excited. These interviews have been fun.
Yes. I hands down agree. I hope everyone likes them as much as we do. Because this is going to be a gem of a topic to listen to. So and she's a dynamic person too. We are about to chat with Lauren Scafe. She is a local sex therapist to Wichita. So that's the topic of discussion today, SEX. She also is an RN. She has some other tools in her tool belt too that we'll learn about, but this is going to be an awesome conversation. We're so excited for you to join us for it.
Yeah, let's start the conversation.
Well, hello, Lauren. It's so good to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
We want to just dive right into all things sex and sex therapy this morning. And so to start us off, will you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are now, and any just the backstory so people kind of know where you're coming from and what brought you here?
Sure. So I will start out with the fact that I am a mom of 4 and I am a wife. My kids are almost 18, 16, 10, and 6. So that I would say my primary in life is to raise good humans. And I am a nurse. I'm actually a public health educator. That's my first degree. And I went back to nursing school and worked for 12 years as a nurse. And then COVID hit. And I decided to go ahead and pursue my dream of therapy. So I have my master's in social work. And right when I started work school, I also started my sex therapy certification through ASECT. And I'm not completely certified yet. Just want that disclaimer out. I have one more small step in the process to go. A bit of extra information on sex therapy. And then also I'm working on my perinatal mental health certificate. That's who I am. I'm also owner of Parish Wellness Club in Wichita, and we primarily cater to the perinatal population, but everybody has a little bit of a different specialty. But we're really proud of the group that we brought together. I think they're all doing really great things.
Okay, perfect. Well, before we get into some of the meat and potatoes of this conversation, why don't you introduce or clarify maybe what sex therapy actually is? I just keep thinking of Meet the Fockers and like just the Hollywood portrayal of sex therapy. And so I think that could be a really good place just to let's lay a good foundation here before we jump further in.
Sure. I think that this speaks to, and I'll try not to go down a rabbit hole on this, but I think this speaks to the fact that, sex is everywhere, but it's not normalized almost anywhere. And we still have so many taboos and so much shame and uncomfortable feelings around the topic. And sex therapy really is, I would well, sex is everywhere. So sex affects lots of things that we do. And topics that we talk about in sex therapy include, low desire, painful sex, sexual trauma, sexual abuse, gender orientation, sexual orientation. We discuss male dysfunction. Really, it affects everything. We discuss things like infidelity and how that affects relationships. So really, really wide open on all the different that it could go down. But what we don't do is there is no part of sex therapy that involves, me watching what people do, or that I think that's like a weird preconceived that people sort of not part of it, whatsoever. But we do talk about things like pleasure and desire and all the good stuff too.
Yeah, that's good. I know I've had people before because obviously in pelvic floor therapy, we definitely have a layer that we talk about as far as, it could be sex therapy or just like any sort of mental health therapy that's a layer to what somebody might be dealing with. And I know I've had people are like, well, what do they even do in sex therapy? And I think I'm glad you clarified all of that because, and most of the time I kind of basically what you just went through, but just giving them that like how amazing it can be for
Yeah.
individuals, like how awesome to have a space that's safe to talk about all of that. Because you're right, there's just so much shame around it and people don't know who to talk to about these.
Exactly.
And I think so this kind of leads to I think what we're going to dive into first, and we'll kind of, which is low desire. So Lauren did kind of happen to do a poll last week about low desire, and then it has come up with a couple of questions that you guys submitted, and then also Roxy is not throwing you to the bus, Roxy. She mentioned this before. She's like, I've got questions because Roxy's currently in the postpartum and stage of life and how low desire she's noticing. But gosh, when you did that poll, there's so many different things that affect that and influence that. So we'll let you take it from here and let's dive into low desire and what you find and all the good stuff.
Sure. Low desire is such a complex subject because, when I did that poll, I asked people, what are your barriers to intimacy? And I like to frame it as intimacy and not just sex because I think sex is a very like narrow definition of what pleasure can actually mean. But low desire happens for so many reasons, stress, energy, kids, burnout, emotional labor, work-life balance, whatever that actually means. It's just all the things, and it's so individual. Folks that have a history of trauma, people that, are navigating painful sex. It's just a very, very nuanced conversation and very individual as to why people are dealing with low desire. But one thing that it seems like a very simplistic place to start. But when we talk about desire, we often go to the individual and say, let's talk about pleasure to begin with. Like, where do you experience pleasure in life, non-sexual or sexual? Do you enjoy, being in your body? Do you enjoy eating pleasurable food? What do you do for joy in your everyday life? Issues around relationships and how well you communicate and all of those things. It's just a very layered conversation.
Man, that's fascinating, Lauren. Just even, I think that question's really powerful and I haven't ever thought of that of just like, am I experiencing joy and pleasure and like, just, like
Anything.
that outside of like sexual experiences. And I think that just like, I don't know, that just blew my mind of, man, am I even tapping into some of these other parts of my life? And if that's hard, then it's going to probably, I imagine then even be more complex than to experience that intimately if I'm not experiencing that otherwise.
Yeah, and I love framing it from that perspective because so many women, and it breaks my heart and I want to scream it from the rooftop. They come in and they think that they're broken. They think that they're the problem, and they're not. They're burnout, they're overworked, they have a bulk of the emotional labor in their relationships. They quite frankly, we can get into it, but there's an orgasm gap between how men experience orgasms and women, and maybe people don't exactly even know what to do. But if you are struggling with communication, you don't know how to say to your partner, like, hey, I've never actually even had an orgasm, because that's something a lot of people experience. And then there's shame around that. So it's just a very layered conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. You like the question you asked was, what is your biggest barrier to intimacy? And so you had like 33% of people put time, 19 was enjoyment, 42% was stress, and then 6% was pain. And when you talked about like the like burnout, and obviously that's like going with stress. And then when we tie that back into, it's like as females, when we think about like our cycles, one of our vital signs. So then you start to get like, you see like maybe somebody's like cycle is longer and we're like, okay, you're one of these vital signs is showing there's a problem. And then there's burnout. Well, then, it's like when you look at it also from a hormonal component too. I mean, you have women, we have women come in all the time. And then we find out like their testosterone's just bottomed out. And so you have all these components that like are compiling on top of each other. And to just be able to kind of help somebody navigate because I mean, the biggest thing, I feel like what you're just saying is then you just get all the shame around it. Like, I feel bad now because I don't have any desire for this. And now my partner who, like it's.
Sure. Yeah. I always tell people when they come in low desire, I'm like, we're going to rule medical before we go down the psychological, and
That's good.
And we need to get all these things done before you can sit here and say you're broken, because I think women and, we're just socialized to think that we're the problem. That's not necessarily true. We just don't have all the information yet. We know in order to take a look at and feel empowered, honestly, to take back our pleasure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and so the next step of when you did your poll was what type of stress holds you back from intimacy? Because you had like the highest was stress. And so it was emotional labor burnout was 33%. Division of labor, like within the home was 16%. Work-life balance, 34%. And not knowing how to communicate, 17%. And I mean, I feel like, a couple of those were a little bit lower, but across the board, it's like, okay, all those things are pretty.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it just takes, and this is why I always say sex is biopsychosocial. There's a whole biological component to it, a whole social component to it, and a whole psychological component to it. So when we look like what's going on, we really have to understand holistically all of the different areas of people's lives. And this even includes, one big thing that we talk about a lot is being raised in more like purity culture and the messages that you received around sex. And do you still carry that shame around sex? And do you feel like you're allowed to be a sexual being? And another thing that, people deal with a lot is, and I'm not here to say one way or another on, religion, obviously, but, if you grew up with a sex negative message, then it can be very hard to then carry it and to kind of flip the switch and then, really understand how to engage in sexual relationships and know what you're doing. So that can be a very hard for people to process too.
Right. When we were talking about that, because it's like when you say that you don't even know what you're doing, and then you don't even know who to talk to get help from and have some guidance with, because then it's like you have other layers on top of that of even being able to bring up the conversation. So, and it's fascinating because, each one of these things that like the different, what type of stress holds you back from intimacy, each one of these emotional burnout, all the different ones we listed out could be their own topic of a whole podcast, I think, of themselves. Because if you talk about like emotional burnout, well, gosh, you could dive deep into that of what brings that on. So, Roxy, obviously you're like right now, we could do a little assessment of you. What do you, I mean, obviously, like we talk about big time, like hormones and stuff, and you're still nursing? Is that right? Or you?
I just finished. And so I wonder too, if you wouldn't mind, Lauren, just like speaking to that, like the me's that are listening of like either your postpartum and breastfeeding, or just like coming out of that season too, of like, what there is out of my not out of my control, but kind of it feels a little bit out of my control, or I'm not normal, of like the normal me of just where my hormones are at, and just maybe even speaking to that person and giving a couple of us just maybe a little bit of comfort of saying like, yeah, you're in the thick of it, or you're coming out of that, and like how our bodies are kind of adjusting to that and what that looks like from even like a physical standpoint versus, like you said, the mental or the emotional side.
Yeah, I mean, I think this speaks to something that I haven't even touched on, which is a huge issue, but body image. I think it goes back to who's worthy of having pleasure in our society, what body shapes, what body types, what even down to who you love and what you look like. I mean, I think that's a whole different conversation in and of itself. And to your postpartum, your identity shifts, and who you are as a mother, who you are as a wife or a significant other or partner, and all of that is shifting along with your hormones. And if you're breastfeeding, you have different changes like that. And then just even conversations around time and time again, I have people come in and I'm like, well, did anybody talk to you about using lube?
Oh, I
No,
know.
nobody did. And so they're struggling with that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like it could be in the disposal packet at the hospital, like
Amen.
let's normalize that. And then let's go back to also, just because 6 weeks and you're clear, not mean you should have pressure to have any sort of intimacy. There's a lot of pressure with that. And I always see people, if you're comfortable with self-touch, that's a great place to start, because it can be very scary, and it can be very scary to know, is this hurt? I don't know what this is like. And if you had any kind of tears or trauma or just general birth trauma, all your relationship to your body is going to be completely different. And then to add to, like if you miscarry or if you have a stillborn, all of those that really, really change your relationship to your body. And so knowing yourself and then having a partner in life that's supportive of you taking things slow, and, so I think that's all, it can be a lot.
Yeah. I wish everybody saw us recording right now, because I was just sitting here like shaking my head up and down, because this whole, I mean, goodness. Okay, let's just going back to just the lube alone.
Yeah.
I mean, so Roxy and I go to this conference. We've been twice now, and it's this Pelvicon conference. It's amazing. And one of our like biggest mentors she works, gosh, Roxy, Michelle Lyons is over, she
Ireland.
is Ireland. And one of her biggest points, honestly, it's like a simple point, but we need to be saying basically like, not anymore, are you using lube?
Yeah.
Like, but what lube are you using? And you need to be using it. And it's very important. And it is kind of mind blowing that it's not like talked about more. Lube is not a bad word. We don't have to like giggle about it. And then the other thing is estrogen, topical estrogen cream. That's another one that we know how much it can help, and it stays very localized. And we have receptors in the vaginal tissue that right at the opening that is very receptive and can be very helpful in that postpartum phase. And it's just not talked about. And here recently, it's just been really heavy on my mind, because it can be a game changer for a lot of women. I mean, you're feeling like you have constant yeast infections. You feel like you're like, I don't know if I have a UTI. I don't know if I have a yeast infection. I don't know what's going on. And sometimes something like that simply can help. And obviously, if it's appropriate, there's maybe certain reasons why you couldn't, but normally a low dose while you're nursing is okay. So, goodness, I know, just those 2 points alone.
And I just kind of want to in here, and I should have said this at the very beginning, this disclaimer, that I think we are trying to fix individual issues that are systemic issues. And I think
Right.
this is systemic
Yes.
women's health, a
Yes.
systemic barrier to more research about that our sexuality matters. That, I mean, shoot, they just came out with information that they just started testing tampons with real blood. I mean, there's an overall lack of, I think, our experiences matter, and they should be researched more than they are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the research is often, I mean, Roxy and I are currently in this like fertility certification program. And that realm, a lot of the research hasn't even caught up to what we're finding in the clinic of what we can do. People are like, well, is
Yeah.
there research behind it? Well, it hasn't even caught up yet. We know we can make an impact, but it's just not there yet. it's you're right. But this is a systematic, like it is a bigger problem than just we're just starting to see how it's like the trickle down where if this would all be talked about sooner and just
Sure.
become standard and repeated, then it would be so helpful for everybody.
Yeah, and that immediately brings my brain back to, just sex education in general and who has access to sex education and who has access to sex research. And it's all very, it's all very still heteronormative and, very it in a lot of ways. And that's a whole different issue to go to. It's just very hard to access information that really is inclusive and all encompassing, makes a lot of people feel seen and heard. So it's
Sure.
hard.
Sure. And I just think about the woman who comes in and has shame and feels bad because she has no desire. But to be able to hold that space of, well, yeah, like Roxy, I mean, you're touched out. You got a bait, like you're holding you're served, like you're so in the season of.
Yeah. I actually just posted some yesterday that said mothers are touched out because at the end of the day, the word of touch that feels like obligation.
Ah,
And there's
yeah.
no space for touch that feels like desire. I think a big question that it's so simple, but I always ask people, and it's a personal question, but I'm like, are you having sex worth wanting?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
And that's a really hard question because then people don't want to hurt their partner's feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, very much hold space, the I versus the we. Like, I just want to hear about you right now. I know you love your partner. That does not have to be your disclaimer. Just like I know you love your kid. You don't have to let that be a disclaimer to tell me all the things about motherhood that are hard. But I just want to talk about you and what's really affecting your desire.
That's so good.
Well, and I think I just think about too, just in the season that I'm in and kind of being able to relate with patients too, of like the benefits and the ripple effects of taking care of ourselves, like are priceless, and it's like we feel embarrassed or shameful or like bad about prioritizing ourselves in any way, shape, or form. But the reality and the truth is that it's not selfish. It's actually going to then make us better moms. It's going to make us better humans, better partners, better wives, of all the hats that we wear. But like, man, that seems like a huge barrier that I hear of, like even lies in my own head, but also my patients of saying like, this isn't selfish. Like your kids or whoever are going to benefit, from you taking care of yourselves. And that honestly, I sometimes believe that lie too, that it's selfish for me to like want better or do something that doesn't include my kids or my husband or, like for me just to take care of myself feels almost like luxurious and it shouldn't. Like that should just be normal, I guess.
And I think it goes into, people pleasing and deconnecting the idea of women and who we can be and why does that make us selfish and why, and one thing I want to say before I get it, because that's how it works though, too, is the standard of good intimacy is not having orgasm, right? Like, are you having intimacy worth wanting? Like, what's your measure of pleasure? And I didn't that's Emily Nagoski, and she wrote Come As You Are, and that should literally be required reading for people at the appropriate age that you deem in your family to be appropriate. But like, I just think this expectation that we should have an orgasm every time and that it should be amazing every time, it just more pressure on people. And there are so many ways to define what good pleasure is. And you get to do that for yourself. It's like one of the questions people say is, I'm only having sex, X amount of times my normal. I'm like, I don't know what works for you, because what works for you, Megan and Roxy, maybe doesn't work for me. And we can't have one measure of what's normal.
Okay. Yeah. I love what you were mentioning about how like intimacy doesn't always have to equal orgasm. And I know that in working with my own therapist, she has mentioned that before, as far as, like intimacy looks, it's so different. And it was really helpful for me and my husband to know that like there, I mean, gosh, she had us do like one time, or this was years ago. It was like, you probably know what I'm going to talk about. I don't know. It's like a 6-minute hug or whatever. It's like you like hug for like a really long period of time. And then she asked us afterwards, she was like, so like, how did you feel like afterwards? And my response, of course, sometimes men have a little harder time describing their feelings, but I was like, I literally felt later like I had a really intimate time with my husband, almost like you would after you had sex, like later that day, of just like being very close feeling. And I was like, wow, that was really good exercise to do, because it was just a long hold. And it like it like blew my mind, So now I'd be like 6-minute hold, hug.
Absolutely. Because think about like the oxytocin in that, and all these expectations that we put on ourselves for everything to be mind-blowing and amazing is just another way to keep us stuck in that shame spiral of nothing we do is good enough. And that's just simply, it's not true. And also, some people may not ever orgasm, and they're okay. There is nothing wrong with that. You're not broken. It is just a normal thing that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I just had somebody in the clinic recently that lots of complex like layers to her diagnoses and everything, but recently has gone through a season where she's unable to have any sort of like penetrative sexual experience. And, she's scared that she's never going to be able to again. And all signs point to we'll get there. But she just, she mentioned like, it's so important. And I just really want to do this with my husband. And we explored that of like, what else can we do that doesn't require that you like, and the goal for both of you being very clear going in is not to orgasm. Like she was putting so much on that. And I was like, let's try to be intimate. But like neither one of you, there's an expectation. So then she doesn't feel bad. Like she doesn't have to have any feeling like she has to perform or do, it was just a really good conversation. And so we kind of explored that. And so I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Oh, I do. Okay. Okay. First of all, like, I really don't want to invalidate anybody's,
Oh, absolutely.
Important to her. And so that's great. But also I feel like the lens is super narrow on this, and let's pull it out and think about the fact that we define sex as penetration.
Yes.
That's very, again, heterosexual idea of what sex means. Sex can mean so many different things. So we're talking about redefine sex, because also I'm thinking like my brain is firing off in so many different directions, but I'm also thinking about men who struggle with dysfunction. If erection is not, then we have to redefine sex, and that's okay. Penetration is not the goal. Most women do not orgasm through penetration. We orgasm through clitoral stimulation. So maybe I never want to define sex as penetration, because that's not even how I enjoy sex, right? But our standard then is male pleasure. And that's simply so just small, And I think we can really pull this out and define it so many other ways.
I love it. And that's why if someone's going through this, working maybe with a sex therapist, it just opening the door and shining light on defining it differently and what it means. And to get through, like, if you're in a season, like you said, like, not to invalidate anybody's, like, that's their goal. And we can all appreciate that. But in that season of what they're going through, to be able to look at it differently, so that in the season that's hard, to still find pleasure with your partner. And then it doesn't have to be completely off the table. And then that way you can work through it together. And then you don't feel so isolated. And then it has less shame because I can't do this and can't do that. Gosh, it's just like to be able to find that joy in whatever pleasure looks like during a season that might be really hard and difficult. And then to be on the other side, like to be able to work through that together. Oh, so good. Let's segue a little bit into like desired discrepancies. Say that 10 times fast.
So I think too, before we talk about desire discrepancies, we have to talk about the different types of desire. So, a real quick recap, we have responsive desire, we have spontaneous desire, and we have contextual desire. So again, this is a very gendered look from the research, but some people, let's put it this way, some people have spontaneous desire where we're just sitting here and we're like, oh gosh, I would love to go have sex right now. But a lot of people have responsive desire where it's like, I need some. Well, I heard this quote the other day and I loved it. Foreplay is everything and everything is foreplay. And I think that that's so true because you think about like the emotional labor part of things. And, if you have a partner who is an equal partner, that is a foreplay for a lot of people, right? But to go back to responsive desire, it's sort of like, yeah, I think I might want to have sex tonight, but what can we do to kind of get in the mood? And maybe you're willing to have sex or to even entertain the thought of intimacy, and so you're willing to show up for it. And then once you get there, you're like, oh yeah, no, I really do like this. And then you really do get in the mood, but you need a little bit of stimulation before you actually get there. And then with contextual desire, it's very much like, the context of my house is 4 kids and laundry and cleaning. And sometimes this is why when people go on vacation, they say they had the best sex of their life because the context is no stress, no kids, no anything, And I think the scary thing is we primarily see spontaneous desire portrayed in media and things like pornography, and it's just not an accurate representation of what sex really is. And so then people have these differing types of desire, but maybe the person with responsive thinks that they're broken because they never spontaneously want to have sex like their partner does. And so, and I tell people too, like, you will have desire discrepancies, like when I think about it from like, sometimes my husband and I want to go eat at the same restaurant, but most of the time we probably want to go eat somewhere different from one another. And sometimes he's hungrier than I am. And sometimes, it's absolutely no different. I think it's just another cultural expectation that if your partner's turned on, then, oh God, so am I, right? Like, no, maybe I am, but probably I'm not. So what have I done to want to show up to that party?
Goodness, God, that's
Yeah.
so helpful.
I have a question then. I want to
Okay.
speak into, I want you to, so going back to that context. So I can 100% relate with that idea of like when I'm in the context of cooking supper or like whatever that is, like that's not on my radar, right? But then the idea of like going into then vacation and being free of that, right? Then all of a sudden there's like you're like I 100% relate with that of like, oh, those thoughts, those stresses, that like to-do list is not on my mind anymore. So what have you found then, or just as if you just did a quick intervention here of like the person that we can't live in vacation. Like the reality is that we live in the context that we live in. How do you reconcile that then?
Yeah, so something else that I was just sitting here thinking about too is the fact that this is why, like Megan spoke about earlier, you know, to me, Megan, when you were talking about you and your husband hugging, those are rituals of connection, right? Like, what are you doing the ritual of connection? I talk to clients a lot about transition periods during the day. Do you give your partner a hug and a kiss before they leave when they get home from work? Like, are you noticing your person outside of just wanting sex? Because if the only time my husband touches me is when he wants sex, I'm going to say, get away from me.
That's great. Yeah.
See me throughout the day because I'm not an object and I do not want to be objectified. Like, you can go take care of yourself if you need to. That's not the only role that I serve. So I think you have to be really clear about, how do you want to be seen in your relationship too? And you really have to set that expectation and communicate those wants and needs. But this comes back to a huge barrier of communication.
Yeah.
Being able to say, I liked that, I don't like this, and feeling worthy of, saying my needs matter too. And I think this goes into people pleasing and all of these cultural messages that we get. But I guess I would say with the context part of things, relationships are so much work. Being married is so much work, and it is so intentional to stay emotionally connected, to stay physically connected, to stay connected through those small rituals. And I think I would say it's not the big things, right? Like if we're all sitting around waiting to go on vacation and have mind-blowing sex, what an absolute letdown. So like what are small things that you're doing every day to connect with your partner? And it is just so much about staying intentional, and then also recognizing there is a season of life for everything. There is a reason that couples feel most disconnected right after they have babies and when they have small kids, because they are pulled in 1,000 different directions. And I think just really having grace with one another of like, damn, this is hard right now, isn't it? Like, yeah, like, and I always tell people, like, you're on each other's team. So I
Yeah.
think when defenses come up and when, keeping score starts happening, that's when things can really get really tough.
So good. Well, I just, I think, gosh, I really hope so many people take away from like just hearing those different desire, because I think it sheds a lot of light in the fact, well, I mean, and we see this when we have people come in of once we like explain things like, oh, I'm not alone. Like this is actually a thing. There's different levels of it. And then how you mentioned, so listen, I love a good book, some Colleen Hoover, but I will say I have sat and thought to myself when younger women are reading these books that is more spontaneous desire, which is not real life
Yeah.
for, as far as like you're just there and everybody's, then I think like, oh, and they maybe haven't had either early in their marriage or whatever. And so they're reading this, they're like, well, why am I not like this? Why is this
Mhm.
not how, like, why is my
Yeah.
sex not like this? It's like, well, that's not real life.
So I think this goes into like immediately where my brain goes is that a huge part of sex education should be media literacy, right?
Right.
Like be discerning of the information that you're taking in, right?
Yes.
And no, this is not reality. Just like I talk to my boys about pornography. Like, listen, she's gonna look like that. She's not gonna moan like that. It's not gonna smell like that. Like, it's gonna be weird and awkward, and you're gonna make weird noises, and so is she, and you're gonna say awkward things. And it is not like that, right? And so I think really media literacy and is a huge part of it. And I just think too, like the other thing that I'm thinking about in all of this, and this could be a whole different rabbit hole, is, but this is all part of consent, understanding why do I want girls or young women to know what they like and what they don't like and why self-touch matters.
Yeah, I think that just like what I'm hearing over and over again, it's just this communication and such a big point when it comes to this. And I think too of just like understanding too when we say sex education, like this is beyond even like, it's like we have our normal sex ed in fifth grade and then whatever, but you like even like almost like a young adult sexual education class or something along those lines, because it's like dropped in your lap. And then it's like, okay, there you had it. Let's move along. And also, too, I mean, we know there's a big discrepancy between like female pleasure, male pleasure, whatever. But we also do have to remember, I always keep this in my mind, that we, as women in certain situations, communication is a hard piece for us, but then also for maybe our male partners, they weren't ever educated on our bodies. And maybe their education was seen through porn, so then they have no clue. So then it's almost like sometimes they just need a little bit of education on like, hey, this is the clitoris. This is actually the area of pleasure that we need to be focusing on. Or, that sort of thing where because their education was, yeah, basically from like either just don't do it or this is porn or whatever. And so not, and then it just goes, and then but underlying there is the communication and feeling safe to say like, well, that actually didn't really feel that good, or that didn't do it for me. Last week when we talked with Kate, I was like, you're going to be our like Resident. That's what I was going through. She's our resident dietitian. You're a resident sex therapist because there's so many topics here we could go down. I love it. All right. Well, I think this was all, God, so enlightening. Roxy, do you have anything else before we move into more of a Q&A?
I mean, I could keep going, or I could keep asking questions, but I'll rein it in here. So that concludes part 1 of our interview with Lauren Scafe. Hop back on in a couple weeks to catch the second half of this really awesome interview. There's going to be some really good Q&A with her too, and you don't want to miss it. We'll continue this conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Pelvis Project podcast. Help us continue the conversation by liking and sharing this episode with friends. And if you really want to do us a solid, leave us a review. If you'd like to follow us on social, check out the show notes for links. And remember, this week, take a deep breath and relax your pelvic floor.